For a while after that morning, the neighborhood seemed to exhale. The chaos that had been pulsing through every HOA email and every whispered conversation at the mailbox finally started to fade. People were laughing again, kids rode their bikes without their parents peeking nervously through the curtains, and even the board meetings were calm enough that someone brought donut. Karen disappeared. Her car sat in the driveway gathering dust, the blinds on her windows stayed drawn, and the only proof she still lived there was the occasional rustle of movement behind the curtains. I didn't celebrate openly because I knew it wasn't really over. People like Karen don't accept loss. They wait for a new angle, some loophole, some shred of control to crawl back through. I had lived long enough to know that quiet isn't peace. Sometimes it's just strategy wearing a mask. Still, I took the reprieve. I worked on my garden, reseeded the grass near the wall, and even fixed the porch light that had flickered since the day I moved in. Life began to feel normal again, or at least my version of it. Then, one Friday afternoon, I found an envelope in my mailbox that changed everything all over again. It was from the City Development Office. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint claiming that the wall violated municipal sightline regulations. It didn't take a detective to know who was behind it. The complaint meant the city had to send an inspector, again, which meant another round of paperwork, verifications, and potential fines if something was wrong. I was angry, but not surprised. Karen couldn't beat me through the HOA anymore, so now she was trying to weaponize bureaucracy. I called the inspector listed on the notice, a calm guy named Martin who'd done this sort of thing 1,000 times. He sighed as soon as I gave him my address. "That subdivision again?" he said. "I've been there twice already this year." "Let me guess, same person filed it." I laughed. "You probably already know her name." He chuckled. "Karen." We both laughed. He promised to come by early next week, and told me not to worry if everything was built to code. I had all the paperwork ready, every permit signed and sealed, but I couldn't help feeling that creeping frustration again. The sense that no matter how many times I proved I was right, she'd always find another way to make me defend it. When Martin showed up the following Tuesday, Karen was waiting. Of course she was. She'd somehow found out the inspection time, and was standing at the property line with her arms crossed, sunglasses on even though it was cloudy. I greeted Martin, handed him the paperwork, and he began his measurements. Karen hovered like a shadow, interrupting him with passive-aggressive comments about obstruction of neighborhood unity and unsightly barriers. Martin ignored her until she accused him of favoritism. That did it. He turned, looked her squarely in the eye, and said, "Ma'am, if you interfere with a city inspection again, I'll have to file an obstruction report." Her mouth fell open. I thought she might actually explode. Instead, she mumbled something about making a phone call and stomped back toward her house. Martin shook his head and finished the inspection. Everything was perfect, of course. When he signed off the report, he smirked. "You'd be surprised how often her name shows up in our system." I told him I wasn't surprised at all. The moment he drove away, I looked across the street at her drawn curtains and thought, she's out of move. I was wrong. 2 nights later, just past midnight, I woke to a dull scraping sound outside. At first, I thought it was the wind dragging a branch across the pavement, but then came a metallic clang. I grabbed a flashlight, slipped on a jacket, and stepped out quietly. The sound was coming from the side yard near the wall. When I aimed the light, my stomach tightened. There she was, Karen, crouched by the base of the wall, holding a trowel. She froze in the beam like a raccoon caught raiding the trash. "What are you doing?" I said, louder than I meant to. She stumbled to her feet, mumbling something about fixing drainage. "Drainage? On my property?" She didn't answer, just dropped the tool and ran back toward her driveway, her slippers slapping the pavement. I picked up the trowel. The metal edge was slick with wet mortar. She'd been trying to chip at the foundation. Not enough to destroy it, but enough to weaken it over time. It was sabotage. The kind of petty, deliberate thing only someone truly obsessed would attempt. I could have called the police right then, but instead, I took photos of everything. The trowel, the marks, the footprints in the mud. I figured if she wanted to play games, I'd play smarter. The next morning, I sent the photos to Lisa, the board member who had replaced Karen as vice president. She called within minutes. "Unbelievable," she said. "She's actually vandalizing property again?" I told her everything. "You want me to file a formal complaint?" I asked. Lisa didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. We'll handle it from our side too. She's violating HOA property laws now, and that's serious." Within 48 hours, the board sent Karen an official notice of violation along with a warning that legal action could follow. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen, the woman who once used these same letters to terrorize everyone, was now on the receiving end. That week, she tried to defend herself with another flurry of emails, claiming I had provoked her, and that the wall was psychologically aggressive. The board ignored her. Then she tried calling an emergency meeting, but no one showed up. I imagined her sitting alone in that sterile clubhouse, talking to empty chairs, realizing that her power was gone. But she still had one more storm left in her. On Saturday morning, I was having coffee when a construction truck pulled up across the street. A man in a reflective vest got out and started unloading equipment. I walked over to ask what was going on, and he said, "We're here for the wall removal request." My heart sank. "What request?" I asked. He handed me a copy of an order signed by none other than Karen, citing improper approval procedure. Of course, it was fake. The HOA had no authority to remove a structure without board consent. I called Lisa immediately. She was furious. "Tell them to stop. Right now." I showed the foreman my own documents proving ownership, and he backed off quickly, muttering apologies as he packed up. Apparently, Karen had told them she was the HOA president and authorized the removal. That was the moment I stopped feeling even a shred of pity for her. This wasn't just control anymore, it was delusion. Later that day, the police showed up again, this time to deliver an official warning to Karen for filing. The first time Karen marched into my yard waving her clipboard like it was the Constitution, I thought she was joking. It was a perfect spring morning, the air smelled like wet cedar from the fence I had just finished staining, and the birds were louder than the sound of her flip-flops slapping against the concrete. But she wasn't joking. She stood there, sunglasses glinting, voice rising, declaring that my fence was a visual violation of HOA aesthetics. She said those exact words like she was auditioning for a reality show called Extreme Neighborhood Makeover, Tyrant Edition. I was still holding my coffee when she started snapping photos of my fence, my mailbox, even my dog, muttering something about uniformity. That was the first sign that I wasn't dealing with a neighbor. I was dealing with a self-appointed sheriff of suburbia. I should have ignored her, but instead I made the mistake of saying, "Karen, it's a fence, not a fortress." Her lips tightened like a purse being zipped. That was the spark. Within 24 hours, a printed letter arrived in my mailbox stamped HOA violation, unauthorized structure, and I realized my weekend project had just turned into a neighborhood war. When I bought this house, the HOA was barely a whisper, an occasional meeting about landscaping budgets and summer BBQs. That changed the moment Karen got elected as vice president. She treated that title like divine right. The first few weeks, she sent mass emails about lawn heights and flowerbed colors, and most of us laughed it off. But slowly, the laughter turned into eye rolls, and then into cautious compliance. The woman had a spreadsheet for everything: trash can placement, paint shades, mailbox dimensions. I had stayed out of her crosshairs until now, content behind my little cedar fence. But after her clipboard crusade, I knew I'd been drafted into a war I never enlisted for. My so-called unauthorized fence was a simple 6-foot cedar barrier along the edge of my property, replacing the crumbling old one that had been falling apart for years. It wasn't even new, it was approved years before I moved in. The only difference was that I stained it a darker color, oak instead of the HOA's blessed beige. Apparently, that single decision transformed me into a neighborhood criminal. The letter ordered me to restore compliance within 10 days or face daily fines. I almost laughed when I read it, thinking this had to be some mistake. But the next day, Karen herself stood outside with 2 HOA board members, taking documentation photos. When I opened my window and asked if they needed a hand, she didn't answer. One of the board members looked uncomfortable, mumbling something about just following procedure, while Karen barked out measurements like a surveyor at a crime scene. I called the HOA office that afternoon, hoping to speak to someone reasonable. Instead, I got Karen's recorded voice on the answering line, reminding callers that HOA rules ensure community harmony. Harmony. The irony was rich. By the 4th day, the fines had started, $50 per day for non-compliance. I tried reasoning with her in person, but she refused to talk without another board member present. She'd show up at random times, photographing my property like it was a federal investigation. Once, I caught her crouching behind my mailbox with a tape measure. My neighbor, Dave, nearly spat his coffee out laughing when he saw her. "She's lost it," he said. "You'd think you built a watchtower." I laughed too, but inside something was boiling. I spent that night rereading the HOA bylaws, which, frankly, looked like they'd been written by a lawyer with a vendetta against happiness. That's when I noticed something odd, a clause about community-funded boundary enhancements. It stated that if a structure bordered common property, any replacement or upgrade could be shared between the homeowner and the HOA reserve fund. I almost skimmed past it, but something clicked. Karen had approved several community beautification projects recently: new benches, decorative shrubs, even a brick wall near the main entrance. All paid from that same reserve fund. A grin spread across my face as I imagined using that clause to my advantage. But before I could act, things got worse. Karen started escalating. She emailed the entire neighborhood claiming my fence was a safety concern because of its unauthorized modifications. Some of my neighbors started giving me sympathetic looks. Others clearly wanted nothing to do with the drama. Then came the ultimate insult: a notice pinned to my door announcing that a formal hearing would be held to determine disciplinary action. I almost tore it up, but then I realized something important. It listed the HOA's expenses and upcoming maintenance plans. One line item caught my eye: Reserve Fund Allocation Aesthetic Upgrades, Phase 3. The amount was shockingly high, and the signature approving it was none other than Karen's. The hearing took place in the clubhouse, a beige little building that smelled like coffee and fear. Karen sat at the head of the table, wearing her power suit and that smug half-smile that said she thought she'd already won. I stayed calm. I let her rant about property values and uniformity, about how one non-compliant fence could inspire chaos. When she finally paused for breath, I asked her if she had reviewed all HOA regulations before issuing my fine. She blinked, caught off guard. I quoted the clause about community-funded upgrades and asked why it hadn't been applied to my situation. The room went quiet. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably, whispering that he hadn't heard of that rule. Karen's face reddened. "That doesn't apply to private fences," she snapped. "Only to shared boundaries." I smiled. "So, the one between my lot and the HOA's landscaped path doesn't count?" The same board member frowned and said, "Technically, that is shared." For the first time, Karen didn't have an answer. She stammered something about pending legal interpretation, but I could tell she was losing control. I thanked them politely and walked out, leaving her to fume in front of her committee. By the time I got home, Dave was waiting with a beer and a grin. "You poked the queen bee," he said. "Now watch the hive buzz." He wasn't wrong. The next few days, I started getting HOA memos left and right, new landscaping rules, inspection schedules, even a warning about unsanctioned gatherings. She was trying to drown me in paperwork, but instead of reacting, I kept reading. I wanted to understand every loophole, every line she had overlooked. And then I found it. A detailed expense report from the HOA's last fiscal year, showing consulting fees paid to a landscaping firm registered under her brother-in-law's name. I nearly laughed out loud. She'd been siphoning HOA funds through her own relative. That discovery changed everything. What began as a petty fence feud suddenly had stakes. If I could prove she was misusing funds, I could not only clear my fines but force the HOA to reimburse me, and maybe even fund my next upgrade. I started collecting evidence, downloading public records, and documenting every message she sent. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. She hosted an emergency HOA meeting to discuss the dangers of noncompliance, which was basically a thinly veiled attempt to humiliate me. I showed up late, carrying a folder stuffed with printouts. Her speech fizzled halfway through when I placed the documents on the table and asked if she'd like to explain the duplicate invoices. You could have heard a pin drop. That night, she slipped another notice into my mailbox, threatening legal escalation. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I'd seen the cracks in her armor, and now I knew exactly where to strike. The war over my fence had become something much bigger, a chance to expose the queen of the HOA for the fraud she really was. As I turned off my porch light and stared at my perfectly legal fence, I couldn't help but smile. Karen had no idea that the very money she guarded like a dragon's hoard was about to fund something much taller, stronger, and far more permanent than a fence. She'd declared war, and I was about to show her what happens when you underestimate the man with the blueprints. The following week began with the kind of eerie calm that makes you suspicious something bad is about to happen. Karen had gone silent. No letters, no knocks on the door, no HOA emails flooding my inbox. For a woman who treated enforcement like a sacred duty, the quiet was unsettling. I figured she was regrouping, maybe even consulting her lawyer brother-in-law for another round. But silence gave me time to prepare. I spent those days combing through every HOA document I could find online, minutes from old meetings, expense sheets, budget approvals. The more I read, the clearer it became that Karen's so-called leadership was built on a foundation of manipulation. She used rules like weapons, bending them when convenient and enforcing them when it served her image. It wasn't about protecting property values, it was about control. By midweek, I had a full binder of evidence, every suspicious expense, every clause she'd selectively ignored. Still, I needed more than documents to win this war. I needed a strategy that would make her defeat both legal and poetic. One afternoon, while I was staining the gate, Dave strolled over holding 2 beers. He'd become my unofficial war advisor by now, mostly because he enjoyed watching Karen unravel. "So what's the next move, General?" he asked, clinking his bottle against mine. I told him about the clause I'd found, the one stating the HOA must co-fund boundary upgrades. His eyebrows shot up. "You're kidding. You could make them pay for it." I nodded, explaining how Karen had approved several similar upgrades before, all labeled under community enhancement. He laughed so hard he nearly spilled his beer. "So let me get this straight, you're going to build a wall and she's going to foot the bill?" I grinned. "That's the plan." He shook his head. "Man, you're either a genius or you're about to get excommunicated from the neighborhood." I shrugged. "Maybe both." That night, I drafted a formal proposal to the HOA requesting aesthetic enhancement of the shared boundary between private and common property. I worded it in the same polished bureaucratic language Karen loved. I even attached a mock design labeled Community Cohesion Barrier to make it sound official. It wasn't technically a lie, the wall would enhance the aesthetic, it just happened to be my kind of aesthetic, tall, soundproof, and privacy-friendly. I printed it, signed it, and mailed a copy to the HOA office with Karen's name at the top. The next few days crawled by. Every time I saw Karen's car drive past, my stomach knotted a little. I imagined her reaction when she finally opened that envelope, her face contorting as she realized I'd beaten her at her own paperwork game. But surprisingly, she didn't show up. She didn't even acknowledge it. Then, on Friday morning, a thick envelope appeared in my mailbox stamped HOA approved. I almost thought it was a prank. Inside was a signed document authorizing the project, complete with Karen's signature. She must not have read it carefully, assuming it was her own victory. I laughed out loud in my driveway. Dave heard me from across the street and came running. When I showed him the letter, he nearly fell over laughing. Oh man, she signed it herself? This is gold. Actual gold. The following Monday, I called a contractor. A local guy named Raoul came by with his crew to survey the property. "You're building a wall that high?" he asked, measuring along the edge. 8 feet minimum, I said. "And make sure it's reinforced. HOA's paying, so let's make it nice." He chuckled and nodded. We went over designs. Clean stone, neutral colors, solid foundations. Everything that screamed quality. Within 2 days, the crew began laying the foundation. The sound of hammers and saws filled the neighborhood, and by the second morning, Karen emerged from her house like a hornet disturbed from its nest. She marched straight toward the workers, yelling about unauthorized construction. I watched from my porch as Raoul handed her the approved HOA document. She snatched it from his hand, scanned it, and froze. Her expression shifted from outrage to horror. "This can't be right," she said. Raoul just shrugged. "Your name's on it, ma'am." She turned, locking eyes with me across the yard. For the first time, she didn't speak. She just stood there, trembling with disbelief, then stormed off toward her car, probably to call an emergency meeting of her minions. The next day, I woke up to find a city inspection notice pinned to my door. Predictable. Karen must have called in a complaint. I wasn't worried. The permits were all valid. I had made sure every detail was above board. When the inspector arrived, Karen was waiting in her driveway wearing a bright pink visor and holding a clipboard like always. "This wall is a violation of community standards," she declared before he even stepped out of his car. The inspector, a tired-looking man who'd probably seen 1,000 Karens before, calmly examined the documents. He asked a few questions, nodded, then turned to her. "Everything checks out, ma'am. It's approved under HOA guidelines." Her face went crimson. "But it's hideous. It blocks the view." He looked at her flatly and said, "Privacy walls are within regulation." Then he tipped his hat at me, got back in his truck, and left. I couldn't have scripted it better if I tried. By the end of the week, the wall had reached shoulder height. Neighbors began stopping by just to watch the spectacle. Some cheered me on quietly, whispering things like, "Finally someone stood up to her." Others stayed cautious, worried about becoming targets themselves. Karen, meanwhile, went full meltdown mode. She sent angry emails accusing me of defrauding the HOA. She tried to call an emergency meeting, but attendance was low. People were tired of her crusades. I heard through Dave, who knew one of the board members, that even they were starting to question her leadership. The audit committee was beginning to dig into her recent beautification expenses. The timing couldn't have been better. One afternoon, as Raoul's crew laid the final stone for the base, Karen pulled up again, this time with her husband in tow, a quiet man who looked like he regretted every decision that brought him there. She started shouting at Raoul about noise violations and construction hours. Raoul, unfazed, pointed to the schedule posted on the permit board. "We're within the legal limit," he said calmly. She turned to me, shaking with fury. "You think you've won, don't you?" she hissed. I smiled and said, "No, Karen. I think the HOA won. They're paying for it, after all." Her husband's head snapped toward her. "Wait, what?" he asked. She ignored him and stomped back to her car, slamming the door so hard it echoed. That evening, I got a call from another board member named Lisa. She sounded uneasy. "Listen," she said, "I don't know what's going on between you and Karen, but there's up, filling the clubhouse until people had to stand in the hallway." Karen sat at the front, pale and furious, trying to maintain her composure. When the report was read aloud, she interrupted repeatedly, accusing the auditors of bias. But her words bounced off the crowd like pebbles against a stone wall. Finally, the board voted unanimously to remove her from her position. The applause that followed was deafening. She gathered her papers, refused to look at anyone, and walked out. I thought that was the end, but Karen wasn't the kind of person to fade quietly. The next morning, I woke to the sound of banging, loud, metallic, deliberate. I rushed outside and saw her standing by the wall with a hammer, slamming it against the base. She must have come early, hoping no one would see. I shouted for her to stop, but she ignored me. Every hit echoed like thunder in the quiet dawn. I pulled out my phone, recording everything. "Karen, that's vandalism," I said. "You're damaging HOA property." She screamed back, "It's my neighborhood," and swung again, cracking a small section of mortar. Then the sound of another car engine broke through. It was Harold from the board, arriving for an early inspection. He stepped out, saw what she was doing, and froze. "Karen," he said softly, "what are you doing?" She turned to face him, realizing too late she was caught. He pulled out his phone, called the police, and within minutes, 2 officers arrived. They didn't arrest her, just issued a citation, but the humiliation was complete. After they left, she stood there trembling, staring at the crack in the wall as if she couldn't believe what she'd done. I walked over, keeping my distance. "You could have just left it alone," I said quietly. She didn't answer. Her eyes were glassy, her voice barely a whisper when she finally spoke. "You took everything from me." I shook my head. "No, Karen. You gave it away." She turned and walked off slowly, shoulders slumped, the proud stride replaced with something broken. Watching her go, I felt no triumph, just a strange, heavy calm. The battle was over, and though I'd won, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the end of something small but exhausting, like finally stepping out of a storm that lasted too long. The wall stood behind me, unbroken except for the single scar she left, a reminder of what happens when arrogance meets its own echo. The day after the wall was finished, the neighborhood had an odd quietness about it, like everyone was waiting to see what Karen would do next. For a few days, she stayed hidden, blinds drawn, car unmoved. I almost believed she'd accepted defeat, but that would have been too easy. People like Karen don't quit, they regroup. The silence was only the inhale before the scream. I kept busy, cleaning up my yard, watering the shrubs, pretending life had gone back to normal. Then on a humid Thursday morning, a letter appeared on my porch. No envelope this time, just a folded paper with my name scrawled in bold letters. It wasn't typed like her usual memos, it was handwritten, messy, angry. Inside, she accused me of defrauding the Homeowners Association, manipulating official documents, and using deceitful language to exploit community funds. It ended with a threat: "This matter will not be left unresolved." I read it twice, then set it down on the table and laughed. Karen had no idea that every step she took was sinking her deeper. By that evening, the neighborhood was buzzing again. Dave called me over, waving his phone. "You're not gonna believe this," he said, showing me a group chat screenshot. Karen had started messaging several neighbors privately, warning them that I was under investigation for HOA fraud. Some ignored her, others replied with skeptical emojis. A few even defended me. One message from an older neighbor, Mrs. Ferguson, stood out. She wrote, "Karen, we all saw the papers you signed. Maybe it's time to let it go." That single line spread like wildfire. It wasn't just me versus Karen anymore. The neighborhood was turning. The queen bee was losing her swarm. Still, I knew better than to underestimate her. That weekend, I drove down to the county office and requested copies of public HOA filings, just in case she tried something desperate. The clerk, a bored-looking man with glasses, raised an eyebrow when I explained why. "HOA drama, huh?" he said. "You'd be surprised how many people end up here because of that." He handed me a stack of printouts showing signatures, timestamps, and fund movement. There it was, Karen's signature on every questionable expense. Landscaping contracts under her brother-in-law's company, payment authorizations without board approval, and invoices for consulting that led back to a P.O. box registered in her maiden name. It was like she'd made no effort to hide it, confident no one would ever check. I felt a rush of adrenaline as I realized I was holding the blueprint to her downfall. That night, I spread the documents across my dining table and connected the dot. Each expense lined up with one of her pet projects: the decorative benches, the community sign, the flower beds that wilted in 2 weeks. I highlighted them all and took photos, storing digital copies just in case she tried to destroy evidence. Then I wrote a short letter to the HOA Audit Committee summarizing what I'd found. I didn't accuse her outright. I simply requested a review of fund allocations for transparency. I knew that word would sting her because she'd built her whole empire on pretending to be transparent while hiding everything behind paperwork. I mailed it early the next morning, dropped into the blue mailbox before sunrise. By Monday, the fallout began. I was sitting on my porch reading when 2 HOA board members, Lisa and Harold, pulled up in a beige SUV. Their faces looked tense. Lisa stepped out first, holding a folder. "We just came from an emergency board meeting," she said quietly. "Karen's in trouble." I didn't pretend to be surprised. Harold rubbed the back of his neck. "Apparently there's been a discovery of financial irregularities. She's saying someone framed her." Lisa glanced at me, lowering her voice. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" I shrugged. "Just that I read the bylaws she keeps quoting." They both laughed nervously. "Well," Lisa said, "the board voted to temporarily suspend her pending investigation. She's furious." I thanked them for the update, and they left. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't felt since before Karen invaded my life: peace mixed with satisfaction. That peace lasted about a day. The next evening, as I was grilling in the backyard, I heard tires screeching. Karen's white Lexus pulled up in front of my driveway, door slamming so hard it echoed down the street. She marched straight up to the wall and pounded on it like she could knock it down with her bare hand. "You think this is over?" she shouted. I turned down the grill and walked over slowly, keeping my calm. "Karen, you should probably talk to your lawyer instead of my wall." Her voice cracked. "You ruined everything. You set me up." I stayed silent. The porch light flickered against her tear-streaked face, and for a moment I almost pitied her. Almost. Then she spat out the words that made me realize she wasn't done fighting. "I'll take this whole wall down if it's the last thing I do." I leaned closer and said, "You're welcome to try. Just remember, it's HOA property now." She froze, realizing what that meant. The wall was technically a shared improvement, meaning any damage to it would count as vandalism of association property. The look on her face was priceless, a mix of fury and helplessness. She stormed off without another word, tires squealing as she disappeared into the night. The following week was chaos. The HOA office became a battlefield. Half the board wanted Karen gone, the other half wanted to delay judgment until the audit finished. Rumors swirled that she was threatening to sue the entire board. In the middle of it all, the wall stood tall and silent, a monument to her failure. Neighbors started using it as a backdrop for photos, jokingly calling it the Great Divide. Kids drew chalk doodles on it. Someone even hung a string of fairy lights along the top edge. It became a symbol of rebellion, proof that the community could stand up to her tyranny. Karen, meanwhile, kept up her campaign of self-destruction. She started sending frantic group emails late at night, rambling about conspiracies and malicious homeowners. Some residents unsubscribed from the mailing list entirely. Others started forwarding her messages to the board as evidence of harassment. Every email she sent only tightened the noose she'd woven for herself. One night, Dave came over carrying a bottle of whiskey. "You've officially become a legend," he said. "The wall's got its own nickname now." He poured 2 glasses and raised his in a toast. "To poetic justice." I clinked mine against his and laughed. Let's not jinx it. Karen's still got a few tricks left. He nodded. Maybe. But she's outnumbered now. He was right. For the first time, the neighborhood wasn't afraid of her anymore. The power dynamic had shifted. Even the quiet ones, the ones who used to nod politely at her during HOA meetings, were now talking openly about replacing her. A few days later, an official audit report arrived in everyone's mailbox. It confirmed what I already knew. Thousands of dollars in unauthorized spending, all traced back to her. The language was polite but devastating. Phrases like breach of fiduciary responsibility and recommendation for removal. The next HOA meeting was packed. Nearly every homeowner showed. Talk about an audit. Apparently, some of the reserve fund allocations were flagged. I feigned ignorance. Really? That's strange. She sighed. Yeah, and your wall paperwork came up in the discussion. Karen's trying to blame it on an administrative mistake. But the signatures are hers. I thanked her and hung up, trying not to laugh. Karen had walked straight into her own trap. The next morning, an official HOA notice went out announcing a review of all financial authorizations from the past 6 months. Suddenly, Karen's tone changed. No more shouting. No more letters. She started avoiding me altogether. But the damage was done. Every nail that went into that wall was a reminder to her, and to everyone else, that her power wasn't absolute. When the wall finally reached its full height, Raoul called me outside to see the result. It was perfect, smooth stone, clean lines, the kind of craftsmanship that looked expensive because it was. I stood there running my hand along the cool surface, feeling both satisfaction and disbelief. What began as a petty feud had become a monument to irony, a wall funded by the very woman who tried to ban my fence. Neighbors gathered to admire it, snapping pictures, whispering jokes. Dave raised a toast from his lawn chair, yelling, "To the Great Wall of Karen." Everyone laughed, except Karen, who stood at her window watching with a face so stiff it looked carved from granite. She pulled her blinds down, and for the first time since the feud began, she disappeared from sight. That night, as I sat on my porch with a cold beer, the soft hum of crickets filled the air. The wall cast a long shadow across the yard, a silent line between freedom and tyranny. I thought about how absurd it all was, a simple fence turning into a battle of wills. But there was something deeper too, something satisfying about outsmarting someone who believed they were untouchable. I didn't just win a petty argument. I proved that control only works until someone reads the fine print. As the porch light flickered, I realized this wasn't the end. Karen would come back. People like her always do. But for now I had peace. And a wall so solid that even her ego couldn't climb it. Fraudulent work orders. I watched from my porch as she argued with the officer, waving her arms, her voice echoing across the street. He stayed calm, took notes, and finally handed her a yellow slip before leaving. She stood there frozen, staring at the paper like she couldn't comprehend what it meant. I thought maybe this would be the breaking point, the moment she'd finally give up. Instead, she did something I didn't expect. She disappeared for a week. No car, no lights, no movement. Then one morning, a moving truck appeared in her driveway. The curtains were open for the first time in months, and through the window I saw her packing boxes. She was leaving. No farewell notes, no apologies, just silence. The neighborhood watched from their windows, half relieved, half stunned. When the truck drove away, there was a collective sigh, like someone had lifted a curse. In the days that followed, the HOA sent out a notice confirming her resignation and settlement agreement. She'd forfeited her position and agreed to repay part of the misused funds to avoid a lawsuit. The new board decided to redirect that money toward neighborhood improvements, starting with the community park. It was poetic justice, really, her corruption now funding actual good. The wall remained untouched, standing strong through it all, the only thing she couldn't tear down. People started greeting me more warmly, thanking me for standing up when no one else could. I didn't see myself as a hero. I'd just gotten tired of letting one person control everyone's peace. Dave, ever the comedian, suggested we host a freedom barbecue by the wall to celebrate. We did, and almost everyone came. Neighbors brought dishes, kids ran around, and laughter filled the air. Someone hung a sign that read, "Community-funded wall, thanks, Karen." It was harmless fun, but part of me wondered if she'd ever see it. As dusk settled, I stood near the wall with a drink in hand, watching the orange glow of the sunset stretch across its surface. It looked almost golden in that light, a reminder of how something built out of conflict could end up symbolizing unity. Dave joined me, clapping me on the back. "So what now?" he asked. I thought for a moment before answering. Now? I think I just enjoy the quiet. But deep down, I knew this story wasn't quite done. Because the world has a way of looping back on itself, and people like Karen never truly vanish. They just find new neighborhoods, new committees, new fences to fight over. Yet for now, as the laughter continued behind me and the wall stood tall, I allowed myself to believe, even if just for one evening, that the war was over and that maybe, just maybe, peace had finally taken root. For the first time in months, I felt like life had finally gone back to normal. The wall stood tall, the HOA was functioning without tyranny, and neighbors who once tiptoed around Karen's shadow were now friendly again. Weekends were filled with laughter, evening walks were peaceful, and even the board meetings turned into casual gatherings rather than battlegrounds. But underneath that calm surface, something still felt unfinished. The new HOA president, a level-headed guy named Mark, hinted during a meeting that they were finalizing the repayment process from Karen's settlement. Apparently, she had agreed to return part of the misused funds within 60 days. That timeline was about to expire, and something told me that she wouldn't just hand the money over quietly. When I asked how they planned to enforce it, Mark shrugged and said the legal department was on standby. It wasn't reassuring. I had learned the hard way that when Karen felt cornered, she didn't surrender, she schemed. A few days later, my suspicion proved right. I was sitting in my backyard, reading, when Dave came rushing through the gate looking half amused and half horrified. "You've got to see this," he said, waving his phone. Someone had posted on the neighborhood Facebook group under a new account called Justice for the Community. The post was long, dramatic, and obviously written by Karen. She accused the HOA board of corruption, called me a conniving instigator, and even claimed that the wall was part of a nefarious land grab. The comments section was pure chaos. Most people laughed, a few defended me, and others simply typed things like, "Isn't this the same lady who got kicked out?" But there were enough gullible readers that the post got attention. Within hours, screenshots were circulating everywhere. Mark called me that evening, apologetic but calm. "Don't worry," he said. "We're having our lawyer issue a cease and desist. It's all defamation." I thanked him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's meltdown was just the beginning of another storm. That night I couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps outside again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone, opened the camera app, and quietly stepped onto the porch. The security light flicked on, revealing a silhouette near the wall. For a brief second, my heart raced. It was Karen. But she wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, holding what looked like a clipboard. I stayed hidden in the shadows, recording. They walked along the wall, whispering, pointing at certain spots. Then I heard Karen's voice, muffled but distinct. "It's still technically HOA property. They can't stop me from accessing it." The man nodded. My gut told me he was some kind of contractor she'd hired again. They spent a few minutes taking photos, then left quickly when a car passed by. I stayed up the rest of the night, wondering what her next move could possibly be. The next morning, I forwarded the footage to Mark. He called an emergency board session. By the afternoon, they'd verified everything and contacted the HOA attorney. The conclusion was simple but serious. Karen was attempting to interfere with communal property again. They filed an injunction warning her to stay off HOA land until her settlement was complete. I figured that would scare her into stopping, but Karen had always treated rules as puzzles she could rewrite. 2 days later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. It wasn't from her directly this time. It came from a law office representing her. The wording was formal and absurd. She was claiming emotional distress caused by continuous harassment, surveillance, and public defamation on my part. She was suing me. I read it twice, stunned, then laughed out loud. It was ridiculous, but also dangerous. Lawsuits meant time, money, and energy. She wasn't after victory, she was after exhaustion. I contacted the HOA lawyer, a sharp woman named Evelyn, who handled the situation with calm professionalism. She told me to sit tight while she filed a countersuit for harassment and misuse of HOA communications. Meanwhile, Karen continued her online crusade. Every few days, she'd post something outrageous: fabricated text messages, conspiracy theories about secret HOA deals, even claims that I was running an underground contractor scheme. It was both pathetic and terrifying. The neighbors grew tired of it quickly, though. Someone leaked her lawsuit online, and the comments turned brutal. One user wrote, "She's suing the guy who literally built the wall she paid for?" Another replied, "Karen has officially lost the plot." The ridicule must have gotten to her because the posts stopped after that, replaced by eerie silence again. Weeks passed without a peep. Then one evening, while walking back from the mailbox, I noticed something strange. There were fresh markings on the pavement near the wall, small red excess sprayed in a straight line. They weren't there the day before. I crouched to inspect them, realizing they looked like construction markers. My first thought was that the HOA had scheduled maintenance, but Mark confirmed they hadn't. The next day, I saw a city permit notice taped to the lamppost. It listed a request for boundary line adjustment inspection, filed under Karen's name. I felt my jaw clench. She was trying to redraw the property line, claiming the wall extended into a shared space. It was desperate but cunning. If she could prove even a few inches encroached on public land, she could force a partial removal. Evelyn filed an immediate challenge, citing the original blueprint. When the city inspector arrived, the look on his face said it all. He'd been here before, and he wasn't happy about coming back. The inspection took all morning. Karen stood at the edge of her driveway pretending to be cooperative, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and fake smile. She kept interjecting, pointing at spots she insisted were technically public. The inspector humored her for a while, then pulled out the blueprints I'd provided. "According to these, everything's perfectly aligned," he said flatly. "The wall sits exactly where it should." She stammered, insisting there must be an error. He shook his head. "No error. You're looking at the official survey lines." She turned red, muttered something about corruption, and stormed back into her car. The inspector turned to me and sighed. "You've got to admire her persistence, I guess." I smiled. I'd admire it more if she stopped using it against me. By now, the whole neighborhood was done with her antics. People openly mocked her in conversations. Someone even set up a parody Facebook page called Karen's Wall Watch, where neighbors posted pictures of the wall with captions like, "Still standing strong" and "Funded by generosity." The page gained more followers than her own HOA updates had ever had. I thought about reporting it, but honestly, it was harmless fun and maybe a little deserved. The tension that had hung over the neighborhood for months had turned into comedy relief. Still, part of me couldn't fully relax. I'd seen how unpredictable she could be when cornered. Sure enough, the final act came when the settlement deadline hit. Karen didn't pay. Instead, she filed for bankruptcy, claiming financial hardship. It was a transparent stall tactic. Evelyn anticipated it and immediately motioned for a lien against her property. The legal process moved faster than I expected. Within a month, Karen's house was officially listed for auction to satisfy debt obligations. The news spread like wildfire. Even people from other neighborhoods showed up during the open inspection, whispering stories about the HOA lady who went too far. Watching it all unfold was surreal. The same woman who once dictated every blade of grass was now packing boxes under court supervision. The day she moved out, I stood behind the wall, watching quietly as the moving truck loaded her furniture. She didn't look my way, not once. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe pride kept her from acknowledging the people she had spent so long trying to dominate. When the truck finally pulled away, leaving her driveway empty, the silence that followed was almost unreal. It wasn't the heavy, waiting silence of before. This one was clean, final, peaceful. Dave walked over and stood beside me. "You think she'll come back?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not to this place. Not after this." We stood there for a while, the evening breeze rustling through the trees. For the first time, I felt the weight of it all lifting, months of pettiness, manipulation, and frustration dissolving into the quiet hum of normal life. The wall remained where it was, steady and unshaken, like a reminder that persistence outlasts chaos. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt free. After Karen finally moved out, the neighborhood felt lighter in a way that words could barely describe. It was like the air itself had changed, fresher somehow, no longer carrying that tense static that used to linger whenever her name was mentioned. The wall stood tall and unbothered, the grass grew green on both sides, and even the birds seemed to sing louder in the mornings. For the first time in nearly a year, I could sip coffee on my porch without glancing over my shoulder expecting another notice or confrontation. Life returned to what it was supposed to be, quiet, predictable, almost boring. But that kind of peace, the kind that follows a long storm, always feels fragile, like it's holding its breath, waiting to see if it will last. And for a while it did. Weeks passed. Then months. Seasons changed. The neighborhood bloomed with new paint jobs and trimmed lawns, and soon Karen was nothing more than a story parents told their kids when reminding them why it's better to stay out of grown-up business. Yet one evening, a letter arrived in my mailbox that reminded me the past doesn't always vanish. Sometimes it circles back, wearing a new disguise. The envelope was from a law office in another city, one I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it might be another spam notice or one of those property tax adjustments. But the moment I opened it, I felt the old chill again. It was from the firm handling Karen's bankruptcy, notifying me that the auction of her house had been completed. The buyer? A development company named Horizon Estate. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same kind of corporate HOA machine that had fueled Karen's obsession was now taking over her property. The letter mentioned that the new owners intended to renovate and integrate her lot into an expansion plan for the neighborhood, including a new communal entrance. My wall, according to the attached blueprint, sat directly in their proposed access path. They weren't demanding its removal, yet, but they wanted to discuss potential modification options. I sat back in my chair and laughed. After everything, after months of scheming, court battles, and Karen's downfall, it felt like fate was testing me. Was this the universe's way of seeing if I'd learned patience, or if I was about to start another war? The following week, a man named Tom showed up at my door. He introduced himself as the project manager for Horizon Estates, all smiles and politeness, his clipboard perfectly balanced on his arm. "We're hoping to make this a smooth transition," he said, his tone practiced and cautious. "Your wall is very well built, by the way. Impressive craftsmanship." I thanked him, though I could feel the sales pitch coming. "That's why we'd like to propose a small adjustment," he continued. "We're planning to add a decorative archway connecting the new entrance path. If you'd agree to allow partial modification, we'd handle all the costs and include your property in the upgraded landscaping plan." It sounded generous, too generous. I asked him if this was mandatory or optional. His smile faltered. "Technically optional, but it would help the neighborhood's aesthetic continuity." The words made me grin internally. Karen had used that same phrase, almost word for word. I told him I'd think about it, which was polite code for not a chance. That night, I called Dave over to share the news. He shook his head and said, "Man, it's like she left her ghost behind in legal form." We laughed, but there was a truth to it. Karen's influence had changed the DNA of the neighborhood. The HOA board was still functioning, but everything they did now went through layers of caution, like everyone was afraid of waking a sleeping monster. I decided not to respond to Horizon right away. Instead, I wanted to see how serious they were. 2 weeks passed before they sent another letter, more assertive this time, hinting that the project had city approval and that delays could impact the community timeline. Evelyn, my lawyer, reviewed it and smirked. "They're bluffing," she said. "They're hoping you'll cave to keep the peace." "Don't." So I didn't. I ignored the letter, trimmed my hedges, and went on with life as if nothing was happening. Then one morning, I woke up to the sound of drilling. It wasn't loud, just rhythmic enough to make me uneasy. I stepped outside and froze. A crew was standing near the sidewalk, marking measurements with neon spray paint again, almost exactly where Karen had done the same months before. I walked up calmly and asked who authorized the work. The foreman told me they were surveying for Horizon's expansion, that it was just preliminary mapping. When I asked if they had a permit, he hesitated, then admitted they didn't have it on site. I called the city office on the spot. Within an hour, an inspector arrived and shut them down for unauthorized surveying. Horizon got a formal warning for beginning development without prior homeowner consent. I couldn't help but feel the satisfying echo of déjà vu. It was like reliving the battle with Karen, only this time I was the seasoned general who knew every trick before the first move. Later that week, I received an apologetic visit from Tom. His corporate smile had cracks now. "There must have been a miscommunication," he said. "Our team got ahead of themselves." I told him I understood, though the glint in my eyes probably said otherwise. He tried another pitch, this time sweeter, with phrases like mutual benefit and community legacy. I listened, nodded politely, and then said, "There used to be someone around here who talked just like that." She didn't last long. He looked confused, so I let the silence hang. Eventually, he left, promising to return with a formal proposal. When he did, it included an offer for compensation, $10,000, for cooperation with community integration efforts. I almost laughed again. 10,000 might have sounded generous to some, but after what I'd been through, it felt like a weak bribe. I sent back a single-sentence response through Evelyn. Property line and existing structure are to remain unaltered. Months passed, and Horizon eventually relented, choosing to reroute their entrance path instead. They built their fancy archway 2 lots down, leaving my wall untouched. It stood there like a stubborn monument, immune to time, money, and politics. The neighbors cheered quietly, proud that our corner of the neighborhood hadn't been absorbed into the corporate grid. Life resumed its rhythm. The HOA even installed a small plaque near the wall that read Community Boundary 2025. No mention of Karen, of course, but those who knew the story smiled every time they saw it. It became a neighborhood legend, a reminder that one person's spite could build something that outlasted them. One evening, as summer settled into its golden phase, I sat by the wall with Dave and a few neighbors, grilling burgers and reminiscing. Someone mentioned Karen's name, and laughter rippled through the group. "Remember when she said, 'The wall ruined property values'?" one woman joked. "Now it's on the HOA newsletter as a highlight of neighborhood improvement." Another added, "She built her own downfall brick by brick." We all laughed, the kind of laughter that comes from survival, from outlasting chaos. As the night deepened, I stared at the wall glowing softly under the string lights. It had started as a fence dispute, a simple fight over property aesthetics, and turned into something symbolic, a lesson in resilience, patience, and poetic justice. A few weeks later, I got an email from Evelyn. She'd received confirmation that all legal ties to the old HOA drama were officially closed. No pending claims, no remaining fines, no loopholes waiting to be exploited. It was over for good. Reading that, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: closure. Real, solid closure. Not the kind that comes from revenge or victory, but from finally having nothing left to defend. The wall no longer felt like a weapon or a trophy. It was just part of the landscape, part of the story that had defined this chapter of my life. On a quiet Sunday morning, I brewed coffee and walked out to the yard. The sun was still low, the air cool, the world calm. I placed my hand on the wall, feeling the faint warmth of the stone. It was smooth now, the cracks from Karen's last attack filled and polished. In the reflection of that stone, I saw not just a barrier but a timeline, a beginning, a battle, a reckoning, and finally peace. Dave walked by, raising his mug. "Still standing strong," he said with a grin. I smiled back. "Always will." As he walked away, I took one last long look before heading inside. It struck me then how life had this strange way of turning conflict into clarity. Karen had tried to tear down a fence, but she ended up building a wall, one that defined not just a property line, but a boundary between who I used to be and who I'd become. And as the sunlight spread across the neighborhood, touching every rooftop and garden, I realized that some walls aren't meant to divide at all. Some are built to protect peace, even if it takes chaos to lay the first brick.